This is a Bibliomotion audiobook, produced and distributed by Gildan Media in partnership with Bibliomotion. The Age of Melancholy, Major Depression and Its Social Origins, by Dan G. Blazer, read by Walter Dixon. We hope you enjoy this program. Preface. Depression causes more disability than any other psychiatric disorder and challenges the public's health worldwide. Many now view the burden of depression as being of epidemic proportions. Perhaps the frequency of depression is increasing dramatically in Western societies. Perhaps we're just more aware of depression. Regardless, epidemics demand a name, such as an epidemic of tuberculosis or arteriosclerotic heart disease. The name psychiatry and society have chosen for this epidemic is major depression. Society-wide epidemics, however, are almost always caused by some change in the environment, not the body or mind. What is the cause of the current epidemic of depression? We don't know. Why don't we know? We haven't looked. We explore body and mind to understand our age of melancholy, not the environment, especially the social environment. Even as depression has come to the public's attention more than ever before, the search for its social origins has all but ceased. The epidemic of depression has been medicalized as major depression. Medical scientists search for the locus of the problem solely within the individual, whether that locus is hypothesized to be biological vulnerability or inaccurate depressionogenic perceptions of the environment. We are autonomous souls, alone in the crowd. If we are depressed, the problem must reside within us, uncoupled from wider social and economic forces. The diagnosis major depression, when viewed as a medical disease, affirms this uncoupling. If major depression is more frequent among young women, among the economically disadvantaged, and among people exposed to violence, we dare not explore the causal linkage between depression and discrimination, poverty or fear, or so it seems. The rise of major depression, as the prototypic diagnosis of modern psychiatry, and the retreat of social psychiatry reflect the sea change in psychiatry over the past 40 years. In this audiobook, I make an argument for connecting these two trends, and suggest reasons for their rapid evolution and evolution respectively. In addition, I propose that social psychiatry should be revived, albeit in a different form. We must explore the social causes of depression. Social psychiatry must not replace, but rather complement current psychobiological and clinical research. Complement is too weak a term. Basic social psychiatric investigations will compel mental health investigators and practitioners to embed depression within the society from which it emerges. The listener will notice a piece of the causal puzzle dramatically underrepresented in this audiobook: the mind. Understanding cognitive processes, the nature of consciousness, and the influence of the unconscious, memory, and reasoning, to name but a few aspects of the mind, is of course critical to understanding the nature and origins of depression and its treatment. I have chosen to juxtapose the current focus on the biology of the brain and the disappearance of interest in social origins. Many people propose that the mind is the mediator between body and society. Others view the mind as an epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain influenced by environmental stimuli. For the purpose of my argument, I see no reason to enter this debate. I do not propose a grand model of depression. The reader will also note that I do not focus on the contributions of the disciplines of sociology and social psychology, though I refer frequently to studies that have been published by these disciplines. I purposefully have focused my comments on psychiatry. Psychiatry, in many ways, drives other disciplines, especially in the move to a biomedical model of emotional distress. In addition, only the medical profession at present widely prescribes medications, the most obvious manifestation of our changing views toward depression as a society. Fully 10% of the adult U.S. population takes antidepressant medications. I also have focused on the experience with depression and psychiatry primarily in the United States. Though similarities abound across Western countries, the United States has tracked a unique history, in my view. Each chapter contains a section titled A Case in Point that segues to the real world of psychiatrist, patient, and society. Some cases reflect real people. Even though names are changed or omitted, the events are described accurately, while at the same time limited in description so that anonymity and confidentiality can be maintained. The essence of the cases accurately reflects the patient's experiences, though the patients would have great difficulty identifying themselves. I wish to thank the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, California, for providing me with the opportunity to pursue this argument. In addition, I wish to thank my home institution, Duke University School of Medicine, for extending a sabbatical year for these studies. The J.P. Gibbons Professorship in Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences has been critical in support of this year as well. My thanks go out to many colleagues who have assisted me in this work, including Kathleen Much at the Center for Advanced Studies and George Zimmer and Dana Bliss at Rutledge. Finally, I am forever grateful to my wife, Cheryl. Section 1. The Diagnosis of Depression. Chapter 1. Introduction. The biological and the social are neither separable, nor antithetical, nor alternatives, but complementary. All human phenomena are simultaneously social and biological. Richard Lemonton, Stephen Rose, and Leon Kanin. Not in Our Genes, page 1. We live in an age of melancholy. Depression, the most frequent of the serious chronic mental illnesses, causes disability equal to, if not greater than, medical illnesses, such as diabetes and hypertension. Epidemiologic studies have demonstrated that depression exerts the greatest societal burden of all the psychiatric disorders. According to the World Health Organization, depression ranks 4th among the 10 leading causes of the global burden of disease and is expected to rise to 2nd within the next 20 years. Psychiatry and society have chosen a name for this melancholic burden: major depression. The diagnosis and treatment of major depression dominates the practice of therapists, from psychiatrists to pastoral counselors. We are thankful that we do not live in an age of hopelessness, at least from the perspective of psychiatry. Major depression is a treatable disease. Indeed, 70% of those who take antidepressant drugs respond, and relapse following initial treatment can be significantly reduced with a combination of antidepressants and psychotherapy. Despite the good news, a better understanding of the brain, improved diagnostic capabilities, and the improvements in therapy, something in therapists' understanding and treatment of the disease, is missing. W. H. Auden believed that society was adrift after World War I, leading to widespread anxiety, and he designated the era between the world wars of the 20th century the Age of Anxiety. He coupled the epidemic of anxiety with the unstable, anxiogenic social environment of Western Europe and America. The world was a threatening place in which to live. Uncertainty abounded. Given the world situation, anxiety was to be expected. Somehow, however, we seem to have lost sight of the connection between the way we feel and the world around us. How does the world around us currently contribute to our feelings of depression? The medicalization of depression. Today, biological explanations of the burden predominate. Biological treatment is focused on the brain in the form of medications, and psychotherapy for depression emphasizes the need of the individual to adjust to the social environment. Psychiatrists rarely acknowledge that something is wrong with the social environment, and they encourage change in that environment even more rarely. In other words, despite the commonly accepted facts that major depression is prevalent in our society and that our social environment is rife with stressors that make us vulnerable, psychiatry does not link our melancholy with the society in which we live. Social psychiatry, the study of the social origins of psychiatric illness, has all but disappeared as a paradigm for investigating the origins of depression, and instead has been replaced by biological explanations. A case in point. A few years ago, I worked with a group of valued colleagues to sketch a geriatric psychiatry research agenda for the future. We agreed that a focus on major depression made sense as a starting point. The umbrella term major depression encompasses quite a few types of inquiry. We added many research projects to the agenda, including brain imaging of severely depressed older adults and clinical trials of new, promising medications. I am a social epidemiologist and a geriatric psychiatrist. I also am a little older than these colleagues, and well remember the heyday of social psychiatry in the United States. It seemed obvious for me to add items to the agenda from my research and clinical experience. I suggested that we add the study of primary prevention for late-life depression to the agenda. The social stressors of late life, such as the lack of economic resources or the fear of crime, seemed obvious topics to study. In other words, I proposed that we research ways in which depression can be prevented in the first place. My colleagues turned to me in disbelief. One responded, "There is no primary prevention of major depression." I stared back in equal disbelief. Of course, no one had yet proved that changing the living conditions or the social context of an older adult would prevent late-life depression. But we were setting a research agenda for the future, not summarizing findings from the past. Could my colleagues believe that such an intervention was not even feasible? Could they totally discount the context of late-life depression and refuse to add explorations of the social origins of depression to the agenda? Yes, they could. I realized, to my dismay, that social psychiatry had all but disappeared from the view of most psychiatrists. The advance of major depression and the retreat of social psychiatry. Social psychiatry, which thrived during the 1960s, is virtually moribund in the United States, where major depression, born during the late 1970s, has become an everyday label accepted by psychiatrists, their patients, and the public. The term major depression could scarcely be found in the psychiatric literature prior to the publication of the Research Diagnostic Criteria in 1978, and their expansion in the third edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, third edition, or DSM-3, in 1980. John Feiner, another psychiatrist at Washington University, developed the core operational construct of major depression as early as 1972 and applied the term primary depression. I believe the advance of major depression as a diagnosis and the retreat of social psychiatry are linked. During the 1960s, clinically significant depression was divided into two categories: reactive and endogenous, or internal. The most common form of depression was diagnosed as depressive neurosis, a reaction. In contrast to the more severe endogenous depressions, such as manic depressive illness, the much more frequent depressive neurosis was caused by an excessive reaction to internal, psychodynamic, and external stressors. An external stressor was essential to the onset of reactive depression, whether that stressor was the loss of a loved one or a response to a dysfunctional social environment. Depression was a complex malady that required a comprehensive explanation. In the past, psychiatrists expended many words describing the emotional suffering of their patients, for no one word conveyed from one psychiatrist to another the nature, context, and severity of the suffering. The advent of the new diagnostic system allowed psychiatrists to use one label, such as major depression, and another psychiatrist knew what the first had observed. The new nomenclature says essentially that a person has major depression if the following criteria are met, such as a depressed mood and 5 additional symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks. Therefore, psychiatrists have become more reliable, that is, consistent in their use of terms. Unfortunately, though, much of the richness and context of the more lengthy discussions of the past have been lost. Psychiatrists, it seems, have come to believe that if they label the person with a diagnosis such as major depression, they've said it all. In other words, there is a real disease called major depression, and by attaching the label, the psychiatrist pronounces that the patient has the disease. This process of making an idea real has been labeled reification. To treat an abstraction as substantially existing is to reify the abstraction. Reification numbs us to the possibility that depression can be more a signal of the emotionally toxic society in which we live than a thing in and of itself. And if the effects of this toxicity are initially expressed through depression, then depression should signal a need to better understand and improve society. During the first 60 years of the 20th century, medicine in general, and psychiatry in particular, became increasingly concerned about social and cultural contributions to illness onset. There was widespread interest in the potential of community-wide interventions that might decrease the onset and persistence of those illnesses. Social medicine arose from general medicine as a separate entity, even a specialty, though never a large one. The research arm of social medicine was epidemiology, with a specific emphasis on social epidemiology. In addition, the social sciences, especially anthropology and sociology, focused many of their efforts on health and illness. Of all the medical specialties, however, only psychiatry formalized a special relation to the social sciences by developing a subspecialty of social psychology. There was never a social obstetrics or a social pediatrics. Departments of social medicine were almost always separate from departments of internal medicine and were more aligned to schools of public health. Following World War II, social psychiatry gained momentum in Europe and the United States. This momentum was fueled by the belief that social factors contributed more to emotional suffering than biological and individual psychological factors did. The 1960s saw an overarching optimism about the ability of social interventions to counter destructive social conditions. As a result of that optimism, the Community Mental Health Center, CMHC movement was launched, with the goal of intervening in society's institutions, from families and schools to the federal government. Gerald Kaplan, a prominent social psychiatrist of the 1960s, described the goal of the CMHC movement. Primary prevention is a community concept. It does not seek to prevent a specific person from becoming sick. Instead, it seeks to reduce the risk for the whole population so that, although some may become ill, their number will be reduced. A program of primary prevention will focus on identifying current harmful environmental influences, seeing that harmful pressures will be reduced in intensity, and that people will be helped to find healthy ways of dealing with them. Society, not just the individual, was the patient. To treat depression, one must treat a depressogenic society. This focus on society was considered the most effective means of reducing the burden of depression. Psychiatry and government, however, were inept at treating society, and quickly retreated from the broad objectives of the CMHC movement. The retreat was almost universal, and psychiatrists turned their backs on the implications of a potentially noxious society. Social psychiatry, as it was known during the 1960s, had all but disappeared by the mid-1990s. The rapidly emerging medical model of depression within psychiatry facilitated the retreat of social psychiatry. Sam Goose summarized the medical model for psychiatry. Scientific progress in psychiatry comprises two broad streams of investigation, one epidemiological and the other neurobiological. Each requires, reinforces, and ultimately validates a classification of psychopathology. Classification is indispensable for thinking, studying, teaching, and communicating. In the move to sharpen classification, depression became major depression. Specifically defined cases of illness caused by identifiable neuropathology characterized the medical model in psychiatry. If you can define it, you can count it, and if you can count it, then you can search for neurobiological causes. Epidemiology counts cases, that is. The retreat of social psychiatry and the profession's wholehearted embrace of the medical model, however, can only partially be explained by the failure of the CMHC movement to influence society as a whole. Financial constraints, which in large measure scuttled Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, or the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, a popular target, cannot be held responsible for the changes. Other social forces must be explored to explain the changes in the view of depression and the virtual disappearance of social psychiatry during the past 30 years. In Chapter 6, for example, I examine war syndromes, such as the Gulf War syndrome, which many people are inclined to attribute to specific physical toxins, such as oil well fires, excluding the stress of war. Although it should be noted that multiple factors can contribute to war syndromes, perhaps the most significant factors are ignored because they are not specific. That is, they are societal rather than physical. Methodological individualism and its limitations. A broad-based psychiatry must consider biological, psychological, and social origins of disease and dysfunction. Psychiatry, however, has retreated into a narrow, medicalized view of depression, ignoring for the most part the connection between depression and society. Medicalized depression has focused etiological and interventional research on biological origins and person-specific treatments. The classic medical model insists that disease represents specific biological vulnerabilities interacting with specific environmental insults. For example, a family history of coronary heart disease, coupled with a diet high in cholesterol and fat, leads to a heart attack. Treatment consists of specific interventions to correct the individual genetic environmental aberration, such as a change in diet. This medical model has been called methodological individualism. Recently, however, the limitations of methodological individualism for many of the most frequent chronic physical illnesses have been revealed. For example, the serving sizes and fat content of fast foods have increasingly come under attack. Indeed, there is a substantial literature suggesting that the influence of advertising fast foods has contributed significantly to the increase in our sedentary lifestyle and increased obesity. The intuitive answer to the problem of obesity, either that we as individuals are responsible for our weight or that there is something genetically wrong with us that leads to obesity regardless of our behavior, has been expanded to include social forces. In other words, the treatment and prevention of obesity must include intervention beyond the individual to the types and quantities of foods served by the restaurant industry. Consider also exposure to another person's cigarette smoke, passive smoking. Because passive smoking is now thought to increase the risk of lung cancer, many hospitals and other public places have begun to prohibit smoking on the premises. The prevention of lung cancer extends beyond the individual's genetics and behavior. For example, people have known of the connection between smoking and lung cancer for years, yet only when the government banned advertisement of cigarettes on TV and put bold warnings on tobacco products has there been a reduction in smoking. Depressive illness, likewise, should not be constrained by methodological individualism. As with cardiovascular disease, depression must be viewed as more than an interaction between a biologically vulnerable person and his or her behaviors towards a unique environment. Regardless of biological vulnerability, the first episodes of major depression are closely associated with a stressful life event, events often out of the control of the individual. During times of economic turndown, for example, the rate of depression goes up. When the economy is in recession or depression, people lose jobs or face other financial challenges. These social stressors clearly increase the frequency of depression. Yet, the individualistic approach maintains a strong hold on the way we think about depression. All cultures place individual experiences into agreed-on social categories. Americans increasingly project the mood of depression onto biological processes, such as a chemical imbalance, and then turn to biology to validate that mood as natural and unique to the individual. Those in the United States are not alone in turning to biological processes and pharmaceutical answers. In Japan, where severe depression has long been recognized as a medical illness, less severe downturns in mood have been attributed to ki, a downturn in mood because one's vital energy was leaking, because energy was sluggish. Ki was a state of the soul. These downturns were not considered abnormal, for happiness was believed to be not the continued natural state, but rather a fleeting experience. Therefore, seeking medical help for mild to moderately severe depression, what we might consider a less severe case of major depression or minor depression, was not an option. In recent years, however, things have changed in Japan, in large part because of an advertising blitz by the pharmaceutical industry. Kokoru no kaze became a byword across the airwaves. Your kokoru was coming down with a cold, and you could do something about it. What can be done? Take antidepressant medications. Though few would deny that romanticizing suffering is something to be avoided, nevertheless, the loss of sadness as a signal to reflect and assess the world around cannot bode well for any society. How medicalization affects the research of depression. No one can reasonably deny that those suffering from depression deserve as much attention as those suffering from diabetes or lung cancer, and one cannot reasonably deny that relieving the burden of depressive symptoms is a central challenge for healthcare providers. Yet, the boundaries of major depression are far more fuzzy than those for most established medical diagnoses. Although we have tests to identify malignancy in tissue, we cannot diagnose depression by looking at it under a microscope. We have no way to know where the boundary lies between a depression that deserves clinical attention and the usual adaptations to the slings and arrows of everyday life. adaptations that lead people to moan and groan, but from which they emerge as strong as before, and perhaps a little wiser. This fuzziness renders the diagnosis major depression especially deceptive. Specifically, major depression as a medical diagnosis effectively shapes and limits the explorations of its causes. In other words, when clinicians make a diagnosis of major depression, they make a sharp distinction in a span of otherwise indistinct emotional suffering. Grouping so many sufferers under the medical diagnosis of major depression leads to two troublesome outcomes. First, the social forces that contribute to the person's symptoms are not considered. And second, by ignoring social factors, the diagnosis limits the search for treatment and prevention to the individual. Do clinicians have evidence that the medicalization of major depression limits inquiry into its causes? According to the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, depression is a treatable illness involving an imbalance of brain chemicals called neurotransmitters. It is not a character flaw or a sign of personal weakness. You can't make yourself well by trying to snap out of it. Although it can run in families, you can't catch it from someone else. The direct causes of the illness are unclear, however, and it is known that body chemistry can bring on a depressive disorder. Personal weakness in our society is usually attributed to not being able to adapt to the social situation, to not being able to pick oneself up by one's bootstraps, regardless of the circumstances. In other words, the stress, external, versus diathesis, constitutional predisposition model that traditionally was the basis for investigations into the causes of depression has tipped sharply in favor of diathesis, in this case, biological vulnerability. Medicalization also leads to unambiguous assumptions regarding prevention and treatment. Because the assumption is that biological vulnerability is innate, the conclusion is that primary prevention, preventing the onset of depression, is virtually impossible to achieve, except through the use of medications in high-risk populations. According to this model, treatment should focus on individuals, and the core treatment is biological, that is, pharmacological. These assumptions, in turn, shape the research agenda. Within this model, an appropriate research question is, does this antidepressant medication lead to greater symptom improvement than placebo does? In contrast, an inappropriate question is, does reducing stress in the workplace reduce the frequency of depressive symptoms? Of course, it's much easier logistically to conduct pharmaceutical trials than it is to carry out workplace interventions. But it's not the difficulty of intervention that should drive the research agenda. Rather, focus on the individual, and specifically on the biology of the individual, reflects a belief that the manifestation of depression signals pathogenic brains, not pathogenic social environments. Beyond the medical. The current views of depression can be attributed largely to the progressive uncovering of the biological etiology of depression and the development of new and improved medications, as well as to the influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Nevertheless, other factors beyond the influence of biological science and industry focus attention on the body rather than on society. For example, the advertising industry hammers home the message that if we want to feel better, then we must lose weight, improve our complexion, or change our hair's style or color. In addition, we, as a society, face a paradox. Even though we seem to be gaining much more knowledge of and control over our bodies, the promise of gene therapy, for example, our increasingly complex society makes us, in reality, even less in control of our lives than we used to be. We're working far more hours in probably more stressful jobs than we were 40 years ago, but we see no way out of the increasing demands at work and home. Therefore, when looking for answers to our disease, we tend to look in areas that appear to offer the simplest hope of success, improving our bodies and ourselves. But despite the specific success stories we so often hear about in the media, such as the discovery of a new therapy for cancer, the ability of the new biology to appreciably improve our quality of life in the face of today's societal ills is questionable. Nevertheless, the influence on the individual body and brain means that the social origins of depression, especially causes beyond personal control, are today of little interest to psychiatrists and perhaps the public. This lack of interest in the social origins of depression reflects the tendency to attribute depression, and virtually all illnesses, to causes that can, in theory, be controlled by the individual or by interventions directed toward the individual. This person-specific, concrete approach undoubtedly reflects our highly individualistic society.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?